Is the new normal growth rate for India 8%? GDP growth in the last few quarters of this year, as indicated by the red line, has been spectacular thus far. Certainly relative to the December 2022 quarter, when GDP growth fell to 4.3%, that's here, and when the world economy seemed likely to slow, taking us down with it, matters have turned out much better. This is great news. But before celebrating a new normal of 8% in GDP growth, let us look at the data more closely. I'm going to get a little technical, but to really understand the reality, we need to go behind the headlines. Much of the stronger growth has come from government spending on infrastructure, which was front-loaded in the first half of fiscal year 2023 and has already slowed because of budgetary constraints. The government can't keep spending enormous amounts. And this is why the CSO projects GDP to slow below 6% in January to March 2024. Let us delve yet deeper. The blue line is gross value added. GDP is gross value added plus government taxes less subsidies. Typically, GDP growth and gross value added growth move together, but they started diverging in fiscal year 2023 with GVA going down sharply. The reason is subsidy payments were delayed and thus lower. This boosts GDP growth temporarily relative to GVA. Most analysts therefore think GVA growth this quarter is much more representative of true growth. That would suggest growth is closer to 6.5% rather than 8.4%. But there is a second factor which is more worrisome. It is inflation. The government measures GDP and GVA in today's rupees and then reduces that number by its measure of inflation, which it calls the GDP deflator, in order to get real growth. In the past, the deflator has moved closely with CPI inflation, which is what the ordinary person experiences. However, as you can see by the circled bars, the deflator is far below CPI today. It is 1.4%, while CPI is 5.4%. Again, this unnaturally boosts real GDP because we subtract a lower than actual inflation from current rupee GDP. Once again, this will reverse over time, which is why in the last video, I focused on GDP over a long period. However, given all the ways GDP growth has been boosted, it is better to use a back of the envelope estimate for actual real GDP growth for this year. If we take the CSO's estimate of GDP growth in current rupees of 9.1% for the year and apply an inflation correction of, say, 3 to 4%, which is still significantly below measured CPI inflation, we get real GDP growth of between 5.1% and 6.1% for the year. This is creditable. It is around our growth potential, but it's not enough to make a dent in the growth deficit I highlighted earlier. In other words, I'm suggesting we should not get carried away by recent GDP numbers. They're likely to be overestimates of our current growth momentum. In the next video, I will discuss the results of a recent government survey on how consumption has moved over time. It corroborates the message that the GDP numbers adjusted suggest so far.